The man who interviewed me for the job didn't call it a job. He called it a custodial residency, which I learned later was a polite way of saying I'd be living in the same building I cleaned, in a unit I didn't pay for, in exchange for keeping the place running, and never asking why certain things were the way they were. I need to be honest about why I took it. I was 41 and I had $1,100 to my name. My ex-wife had the house, which was fair, and the car, which was less fair. And I had a storage unit in a town I no longer lived in, full of things I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I'd spent the better part of a year doing contract maintenance work, the kind where you drive an hour to fix a water heater, and the company takes most of what the customer pays. So when I saw the listing for a live-in caretaker at a place called the Old Reservoir Pump House and Residence, with a salary that wasn't large but came with housing, I drove out the same afternoon I read it. The place was 40 minutes past the edge of any town worth naming, up a county road that turned to gravel and then to something that was mostly gravel's memory. The pump house sat at the bottom of a long earthen dam that held back a reservoir nobody seemed to use for anything anymore. It was a municipal water facility technically, though the city it served had shrunk so much over the decades that the man who interviewed me said they only kept it operational out of legal obligation. There were valves to turn on a schedule, gauges to read, a generator to test, and a long, low building attached to the back of the pump house where the caretaker lived. That was the whole arrangement. One man, one building, the water, and the quiet. The man's name was Edgar Voss, and he was district operations, which I took to mean he was the one person between this place and the people who signed the checks. He was maybe 60, heavy-set, with reading glasses he never actually put on, just held and pointed with. He met me in the gravel lot and shook my hand, and the first thing he said after my name was, "You sleep okay? Generally, I mean. You a heavy sleeper or a light one?" I told him I slept fine, which was a lie. I hadn't slept through a full night since the divorce. He nodded like the answer mattered and wrote something on a clipboard. The interview, if you could call it that, happened walking. He showed me the pump room first. 2 enormous green pumps that looked older than me. Gauges and glass faces with needles that trembled. A control panel with labeled switches worn smooth. He showed me the generator shed, the fuel tank, the workshop with a pegboard of tools that someone had outlined in markers so you'd know where each one went. Everything was old but maintained. Somebody had cared about this place for a long time, the way you care about a thing you can't leave. The living quarters were attached down a short hallway that smelled like cold concrete and old radiator paint. A kitchen with a stove from another decade, a bedroom, a bathroom with good water pressure and rust-colored stains under the faucets that wouldn't scrub out. A common room with a couch and a desk and a window that looked up at the slope of the dam, that green wall of grass rising so high you had to lean your head back to see the top of it. There was a phone on the desk, an actual landline with a cord. And Edgar told me cell service didn't reach down in the hollow. The phone connected to him and to the district office and to nothing else. "Most people don't last," he said, not unkindly. "The quiet does something to people. They start hearing things in it. You'll either be the kind it bothers or the kind it doesn't. And I won't know which until you've been here a few weeks, and neither will you." I told him I'd been living alone in a one-room apartment with a freeway behind it. Quiet sounded like a luxury. He smiled at that, but it wasn't a happy smile. He looked at me a second longer than was comfortable and then said, "Let's go over the rules." We sat at the kitchen table, and he took a laminated card out of a folder. It was the kind of laminate that's gone soft and cloudy at the corners from being handled a lot. There were 5 rules typed on it in a font that looked like it came off a machine, not a computer. He didn't hand it to me right away. He set it face down on the table and kept his palm on it, Every facility's got procedures, he said. Most of them are common sense and you'll figure them out. These 5 are different. These 5, I need you to follow even when they don't make sense to you. Especially when they don't make sense to you. I'm not going to explain all of them, because the explanations either don't exist or don't help. The men who wrote these down weren't superstitious. They were engineers. They wrote things down because something happened that made them write it down. You understand what I'm telling you? I said I did, though I didn't. Not really. I thought it was the kind of speech a man gives when he's about to tell you to always wear safety glasses and never override the pressure relief. I was wrong about the content, but right that it was a speech he'd given before. He had the rhythm of someone who'd said the words enough times that they'd stopped being words to him. He turned the card over. I've thought a lot about how to describe the rules now, knowing what I know. And the honest thing is that read cold. Sitting at that table, they sounded like maintenance notes written by someone who'd been alone too long. That's the trap of them. They sound boring. They sound like the kind of thing you skim. The first rule said, the reservoir level is read at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. from the gauge house, never from the dam crest. If the morning reading and the evening reading differ by more than 4 inches in either direction, log it and call the district. Do not investigate the difference yourself. The second rule said, the lower access tunnel may be entered only between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. The lights in the tunnel are on a timer that cannot be overridden. If you are in the tunnel and the lights go off before the timer, walk, do not run, toward the entrance, and do not turn back for any tool, light, or sound. The third rule said, if you hear the intake alarm at night, it is testing itself. Do not silence it. Do not go to the intake. It will stop on its own within 10 minutes. If it does not stop within 10 minutes, leave the residence and wait in the truck until morning. The fourth rule said, one resident is registered to this facility. That is you. If anyone at the door, on the phone, or anywhere on the property identifies themselves as the caretaker, the resident, or the man who lives here, they are mistaken. Do not correct them. Do not let them in. Log the time and call the district. The fifth rule said simply, keep the light in the residence window on from dusk to dawn. It is not for you. I read them twice. Edgar watched me read them. When I looked up, he was studying my face, the way you study a gauge, looking for the needle to move. Questions, he said. It wasn't really a question. I asked the obvious one first. I asked about the fourth rule. I asked who else would be claiming to live here, out in the middle of nowhere, 40 minutes from the nearest town. Edgar took his glasses off, which was a thing he did with his hands when he wanted a second to decide how much to say. People come up the road sometimes, he said. Hikers mostly. Lost. Once in a while somebody who used to work here, or thinks they did. The fourth rule keeps things simple. You're the resident. Anybody says otherwise, they're confused. And confused people on a dam at night are a liability. You log it, you call me, I sort it out. That's all it is. That's all it is. I'd hear him say that about a lot of things over the next 2 months. And I'd notice eventually that he only said it about the things that weren't all they were. I asked about the fifth rule. The light. Not for you. He put his glasses back on, which meant he'd decided. There was a caretaker here a long time ago, before my time even, who liked the dark. Turned the lights off to save the district money, he said, but really he just liked it. Bad things happened. After that, they made it a rule. The light stays on. You don't need a reason past that one. Just keep it on. I want you to understand that none of this frightened me at the table. It interested me, the way a strange family's traditions interest you when you marry into them. I'd taken stranger jobs for worse pay. And the truth I didn't say out loud was that I needed this so badly that a man could have read me a much longer and much stranger list, and I'd have signed at the bottom of it. $1,100. A storage unit accruing late fees. A phone that mostly rang with collection calls. I'd have agreed to almost anything that came with a roof and a check. So I signed. Edgar gave me a key ring with 11 keys on it, walked me through which opened what, and told me he'd be back in 2 weeks with my first paycheck and to see how I was settling in. He left me the laminated card. He told me to keep it in the kitchen drawer by the stove and to read it again whenever I felt like the place was getting to me, because that was usually when people made mistakes. Then he got in his truck and drove up the gravel road, and I watched the dust hang in the air a long time after the truck was gone, because there was no wind down in the hollow to move it. The first few days were the easiest of my whole life. I'd forgotten what it felt like to wake up without dread sitting on my chest. The work was nothing. Read the gauges at 6 and 6, walk the dam crest once a day looking for cracks or seepage or animal burrows. Test the generator on Tuesdays. Run the pumps on their schedule. Log everything in a green ledger that lived on the desk. The ledger went back decades. Dozens of caretakers going back to the 60s, each with their own handwriting, each logging the same readings twice a day, year after year. There was something steadying about it. Men I'd never met had sat at this desk and written 6 a.m. and a number, and 6 p.m. and a number, and gone to bed for 50 years. I was just the next set of hands. I read the older entries at night because there wasn't much else to do. No internet down in the hollow. A television that got 2 channels of static and 1 of weather. So I read the ledger like a novel, and I started to notice the personalities in it. There was a caretaker in the 80s who drew tiny weather symbols next to each entry, a sun or a cloud. There was one in the 90s who wrote long, unnecessary notes about the deer he saw. There was the steadiness of it. Decades of ordinary men logging ordinary numbers. But here's the first thing I want to tell you. The first thing that started the whole slow slide. The numbers were always the same. Not exactly the same. The reservoir level moved a little with the seasons the way you'd expect. But the morning reading and the evening reading, every day, going back as far as I flipped, never differed by more than 3 inches. 3 inches was the most I ever found. The first rule said to log it and call the district if they differed by more than 4. In 50 years of entries, across dozens of caretakers, not one of them had ever logged a difference of more than 4 inches. Not once. At the time, I read that as reassurance. A rule for a thing that almost never happened. A what if? Like a fire extinguisher you keep for 40 years and never use. It didn't occur to me to wonder what it meant that 50 years of men had all kept the difference under 4 inches without ever once tripping the rule. It didn't occur to me to wonder whether the rule was describing the reservoir or describing them. The first small thing that I couldn't quite explain happened on my 9th day. I did my 6 p.m. reading, and it was 11 feet, 4 inches, the same as that morning, give or take an inch. I logged it. I made dinner, some pasta with a jar of sauce, ate at the desk with the ledger open out of habit. Around 8, I went out to the truck to get a phone charger I'd left in the glove box, more out of routine than need, since there was nowhere to charge a phone that did nothing down here. When I came back in, the kitchen drawer by the stove was open, the one with the laminated card. I'd opened it that morning. I remembered opening it that morning because I'd checked the card, the way Edgar said to, just to read the rules again and feel a little less alone with them. But I would have sworn I closed it. I'm a person who closes drawers. My ex-wife used to say I was the only man she ever met who closed cabinet doors without being asked. It's a small thing about myself I know to be true. But there it was, open about 4 inches. And the card was sitting on top of the other things in the drawer, face up, when I always put it face down, the way Edgar had it on the table. I stood there with the charger in my hand, and I told myself the most reasonable thing, which was that I'd opened it after dinner without registering it, the way you do things on autopilot when you live alone and your hands move, without your brain. I'd been distracted, thinking about money, thinking about the storage unit, thinking about whether the late fees would eat my whole first check. So I'd opened the drawer, looked at the card, set it face up, and forgotten. That's what I told myself, and I closed the drawer face down, and I went to bed. I want to be fair to myself. That explanation was reasonable. It might even have been true. I'll never know now which of the early things were real, and which were just a tired man in a quiet place. And that uncertainty is its own kind of horror, the not knowing where the line was that I crossed. The intake alarm went off for the first time on my 14th night, which was the night before Edgar came back. I want to describe the sound because the rule made it sound like nothing. The third rule said if you hear the intake alarm at night, it's testing itself. Don't silence it. It'll stop on its own. The way Edgar said it, and the way the rule read, you'd think it was a smoke detector with a low battery. A nuisance. It was not a nuisance. It was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in an enclosed space. It started a little after 2 in the morning, and I came up out of sleep so fast I hit my shoulder on the headboard. It wasn't a beep or a ring. It was a deep mechanical horn, the kind of sound you feel in your sternum, coming from somewhere under the building, from the direction of the intake where the reservoir water entered the system. It would sound for about 4 seconds, stop for 2, sound again, over and over. My whole body wanted to do something. That's what an alarm is for. It's an animal trigger. Something is wrong. Go fix it. Go see. I sat on the edge of the bed in my underwear with my heart slamming, and every instinct in me said, go to the intake. Go see what's wrong. You're the caretaker. This is your job. And the rule said no. It is testing itself. Do not silence it. Do not go to the intake. It will stop on its own within 10 minutes. I looked at the clock. It was 2:14. I told myself I'd give it 10 minutes, the way the rule said. And if it didn't stop, I'd go to the truck like the rule said. And I'd feel like an idiot in the morning either way. I sat there in the dark, and I counted. The horn came and went, came and went. I had the laminated card in my head, the line about 10 minutes. And I watched the clock, and I will tell you that 10 minutes is a very long time when something underneath your bed is screaming. At 2:21 it stopped. 7 minutes, it didn't taper off. It cut, mid-blast, clean, like a switch had been thrown. And then the silence came back so total and so sudden that the silence itself felt like a sound. I sat there a while longer. My ears rang, the pipes ticked. And then, under the ringing, I heard something I've gone back and forth on ever since. And I'm only telling you because I promised myself I'd tell the whole thing. I heard water moving, which is normal in a pump house. Water moves. But this was the wrong kind. It was the sound of water moving slow and heavy in a space that should have been sealed and dry. It came from the direction of the lower access tunnel, the one the second rule said could only be entered between 9 and 3. And it had a rhythm to it. Not the steady rush of a pipe, more like something large turning over in a bath. It lasted maybe a minute. Then it stopped too, and there was nothing. And eventually the ringing in my ears faded, and I lay back down and did not sleep. and watched the gray come up in the window, and thought about the light I'd been told to keep on, and was glad I'd kept it on, though I couldn't have told you why. Edgar came at 10 the next morning, with my check and a box of groceries he said the district provided, which I hadn't known about and was grateful for. He looked at me over the kitchen table, and he didn't even ask how I was. He said, "You heard the intake last night." I said I had. I asked how he knew. "It's on a cycle," he said. "Roughly every 2 weeks. You'll learn to sleep through it eventually. The ones who stay do." He set my check on the table. "You followed the rule." It wasn't a question, but I answered it anyway. I said I'd stayed in the bedroom and waited, and it stopped after 7 minutes. Something moved across his face when I said 7 minutes. It was fast, and he covered it. But I'd been watching gauges for 2 weeks, and I'd gotten good at noticing small needles move. He wrote something on his clipboard. "7's fine," he said. "Anything under 10's fine." I asked him what happens at 10. I asked it lightly, like a man making conversation. He looked at me and he didn't answer lightly. He said, "Don't find out." And he changed the subject to the generator, which he wanted to hear running before he left. Before he drove off, with one foot in the truck, he asked me a question that I didn't think much of at the time and that I've turned over 1,000 times since. He asked, "You been down the lower tunnel yet? During hours?" I said I hadn't had a reason to. He nodded and said, "There's a reason coming. The intake screen needs cleaning about once a month, down in the tunnel. I'll show you next time. Just remember the hours, 9 to 3, and the timer." He paused. "The lights down there, they used to be on a normal switch. Now they're on the timer, and the timer can't be changed. You're going to want to know why. Don't." Then he drove off, and the dust hung in the dead air. And I went inside and looked at my check, which was real and which I deposited the next time I drove into town for groceries, in a bank where the teller asked where I was working now. And I said the Old Reservoir, and her face did a thing, a small, involuntary thing. And she said, "Oh, the pump house," in a voice that made it clear the pump house was a thing people in town knew about and didn't talk about. And then she counted my deposit and didn't say anything else. I should have asked her. I think about that. There was a moment, a clean, open moment, where I could have said, "What do you mean? What do you know? Tell me." And she might have. But I had 11 keys on a ring and a check in my account for the first time in months, and I did not want anyone to tell me anything that might make me feel I couldn't go back. So I took my receipt and I left. That's a thing about me I've had to face. When a place is keeping me fed, I don't ask it hard questions. I learned that from being married, maybe. I learned it from being broke. The routine reasserted itself. 6 and 6, the damn crest, the generator on Tuesdays, the ledger. I got better at the quiet. I even started to like the intake alarm in a strange way, because it was the only thing that ever happened. And a man alone will take an event over no event, even when the event frightens him. The next time it went off, on a Thursday near the end of my 4th week, I lay in bed and timed it, and it stopped at 6 minutes, and I went back to sleep almost proud of myself. But the small, wrong things kept accumulating, and I kept filing them under reasonable explanations. And the pile of reasonable explanations got tall enough that one day I looked at it and understood it was a structure, and that I'd built it to keep something out. The drawer opened twice more. Both times I'd been outside. Both times the card was face up. The light in the window went out once on its own, a 40-watt bulb in a fixture I never touched. and I found it dark when I came in from the dam at dusk, and I felt a fear out of all proportion to a dead bulb. I changed it with shaking hands, and I kept a box of spares on the desk after that, and I checked it every night before bed like a prayer. And the gauges. The first rule: morning and evening, never more than 4 inches. In my 5th week, the morning reading was 11 feet even. I logged it. That evening, the reading was 11 feet, 3.5 inches. Within the rule, barely. But it was the largest swing I'd seen, and there'd been no rain, and the reservoir doesn't fill itself by 3.5 inches in 12 hours under a clear sky in a system with no inflow but a creek I could step across. I stood at the gauge house with the flashlight on the glass, and I read it 3 times. 3.5. The rule said 4. I was half an inch from logging it and calling the district. I remember the specific feeling of being half an inch from a decision. The way you feel at the top of stairs in the dark when you're not sure if there's one more step. I didn't call. 3.5 is under 4. I logged it. I went inside. And then I did the thing the rule told me not to do, almost. The first rule said, do not investigate the difference yourself. I didn't investigate exactly. But I sat at the desk, and I went back through the ledger looking for any other entry near 4 inches, any other caretaker who'd come close, because I wanted company. I wanted to find another man's handwriting that said 3.5 and feel less alone. I found something else instead. Going back through the ledger, page by page, year by year, I started noticing that the handwriting changed more often than it should have. Caretakers don't last, Edgar had told me. Most people don't make it. I'd taken that to mean a year, 2 years, the way seasonal jobs go. But the handwriting in the ledger changed every few months, sometimes more often. A new hand would start, log the readings for 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12, and then stop mid-page, and a new hand would pick up the next day. No gap, no note. Just one man's writing ending and another's beginning, like a shift change, except these were the only people who lived here. And there was only ever supposed to be one, I counted. In 50 years, by the changes in handwriting, there had been somewhere over 100 caretakers, more than 2 a year. Living 40 minutes from anywhere, in a job with free housing and a steady check, men were leaving every few months. And not one of them had ever written a goodbye, a last note. And I'm sorry I have to go. The entries just ended, and new ones began. The readings continuing without a break. 6 and 6, 6 and 6, like the readings mattered more than the men taking them. I found my own predecessor near the back. His handwriting was small and careful, and he'd been here, by the dates, only about 7 weeks before me, which meant the place had stood empty for several weeks before Edgar hired me, except the readings didn't show a gap. The readings continued through those weeks in a hand I didn't recognize. Neither my predecessors nor mine. And I have no explanation for who took the 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. readings in an empty building. And I checked the dates twice, and then I closed the ledger because my hands had gone cold, and I didn't want to look anymore. But the thing that kept me up that night, the thing I want to end on, the thing that turned my pile of reasonable explanations into a wall I knew was hiding something, was what my predecessor wrote on his last day. Every other caretaker's writing simply stopped. His didn't. His last entry was the evening reading, the date, the number, the same as always. But underneath the number, in the margin, in handwriting that had gotten worse over his final 2 weeks, shakier, smaller, pressed so hard into the page in places that the pen had torn it, he'd written something that wasn't a reading. It wasn't addressed to Edgar or the district. I think it was addressed to me, to whoever opened the ledger next, to the next set of hands. It said, The fifth rule is wrong. The light is not for them. Check the morning reading against the evening reading yourself with a tape, not the gauge. The gauge lies. Count the keys on the ring. There should be 11. Voss gives you 11. One of them does not open anything in this building. And under that, the last thing he ever wrote there, pressed so hard it had gone through to the next page. It opened something in the dam. I sat at that desk with the lamp on and the light in the window burning the way I'd kept it burning every night. And I took the key ring out of my pocket and I set it on the open ledger. And I counted the keys, one at a time with my finger, in the quiet. While somewhere under the building the water moved slow and heavy in a space that was supposed to be dry. There were 11. I knew what 10 of them opened. The pump room, the generator shed, the workshop, the gauge house, the residence door, the fuel cabinet, the control panel, the records cabinet, the gate at the top of the road, the spare for the residence. 10 doors, 10 keys. The 11th was older than the others, heavier, darker, the kind of key that's been cut by hand, not by a machine, with a long shaft and a single deep tooth. The kind of key they don't make anymore, for any door I'd ever seen. I'd had it in my pocket for 5 weeks, and I'd never once wondered what it opened. Because there were exactly as many doors as I needed, and I am not a man who goes looking for locks. I held it up to the lamp. There was something scratched into the head of it, worn almost smooth, the way the laminated card was worn smooth, the way the labels on the control panel were worn smooth by a lot of hands over a lot of years. I turned it to catch the light, and I made out 2 letters and 3 numbers, the kind of code you'd stamp on something you needed to keep track of. And below that, scratched by a different and shakier hand. More recently, the way my predecessor's writing had gone shaky at the end, were 3 more words, and I had to angle it twice to read them. And when I read them, I set the key down on the ledger very carefully, the way you set down something you've realized is heavier than it looks. The 3 words were, "Do not match." I didn't understand what they meant. I still didn't then. But I understood that my predecessor had held this same key, under this same lamp, with this same light burning in the window, and had scratched a warning to me into the metal because he didn't trust the ledger and didn't trust Edgar, and maybe didn't trust the building to let his notes survive on paper. And I understood that I was sitting in the exact chair he'd sat in when he stopped writing and never wrote again, and that the readings had continued in someone else's hand the very next day, 6 and 6, 6 and 6, as if he'd never been there at all. Outside, far up the slope, on the dam crest where the first rule told me never to read the gauge, I heard, very faint, the sound of water. Moving slow, moving heavy, moving in a place where there was nothing for it to move in. And the light in the window, the light I'd been told over and over to keep on, the light that was not for me, threw my reflection back at me off the black glass. And for just a moment, before I told myself it was tiredness and the late hour, and a mind that had read too much of a dead man's handwriting, the reflection in the window seemed to be holding the key up to the lamp a half second after I'd already set it down. I didn't sleep that night. And in the morning, I told myself the reflection had been nothing. That's the first thing I want to be honest about. Because the whole rest of this is a story about a man telling himself things were nothing. And the cost of it. Glass at night is a mirror. I'd moved. The lamp had flickered the way it did on the old wiring. My eyes were tired from reading 50 years of other men's handwriting by a 40-watt bulb. There's a version of that night where it's all explainable. And I lived inside that version as long as I could, because the alternative meant I had to do something. And I didn't want to do anything that might end with me back in a 1-room apartment with a freeway behind it. but I couldn't unread the margin. The gauge lies. Check it with a tape. And the key, do not match. So the next morning, after my 6 a.m. reading, which was 11 feet 1 inch, I did the first thing my predecessor told me to do, because it was the smallest thing, and the one least likely to get me in trouble. I went out to the gauge house with a 50-foot tape measure from the workshop pegboard, the one outlined in marker in its own spot, and I measured the water myself. The gauge house is a little concrete box built into the slope at the base of the dam, with a stilling well, which is a vertical pipe connected to the reservoir that lets the water level sit still enough to read. The gauge is afloat on a tape inside the well, geared to a needle on a dial. You read the dial. You never have to look at the actual water. That's the point of it. It's cleaner, it's repeatable. It's what 50 years of caretakers did twice a day. I opened the well cap and dropped my own tape down, with a bolt tied to the end of it until I felt it touch and the line went slack. And I marked the wet line with my thumbnail and pulled it up and read it. The dial said 11 feet 1 inch. My tape said 9 feet 4 inches. I did it again. I'm a practical man, and I assumed I'd done it wrong, fouled the tape on a bracket, misread the wet line in bad light. I did it 3 more times, 9 feet 4, 9 feet 4, 9 feet 3.5. There was almost 2 feet of difference between what the gauge said the reservoir was holding and what the reservoir was actually holding. The gauge said the water was higher than it was, by a lot. For 50 years, every man who'd sat at that desk had logged a number off a dial that was telling him the reservoir was fuller than it was. And not one of them had ever caught it, because not one of them had ever been told to drop a tape. Because the rule, the first rule, said read it from the gauge house, never from the damn crest, and don't investigate the difference yourself. The rule wasn't there to keep the readings accurate. The rule was there to keep us reading the dial. I sat in the gauge house with the tape wet in my hands, and I thought about that the way you think about a thing you can feel is important before you understand why. 2 feet missing. Where does 2 feet of a reservoir go? And then I thought about the intake alarm and the water moving slow and heavy in the lower tunnel at night, in a space the second rule said was only safe between 9 and 3. And I thought, it's going down there. Somewhere down there is taking it. And the gauge has been built or rigged or maintained for 50 years to hide that the level is dropping. Because if the district ever saw the real number on the real dial, they'd send engineers, and engineers would go down the tunnel. And the second rule exists so that nobody goes down the tunnel except on a leash between 9 and 3, with lights they can't turn back on. I want to be clear that I didn't think all of this at once, sitting there. I'm making it sound clean. It wasn't clean. It came over days, in pieces, the way you assemble a thing you'd rather not assemble. But that morning was when the rules stopped being a strange family's traditions and started being something a smarter and more frightened set of men than me had built on purpose to manage something. And I was the latest in a long line of hands they'd hired to keep the machine running without ever showing any one set of hands the whole machine. I didn't log the tape reading, that's worth saying. I logged the dial, 11 feet 1 inch. I wrote the number the gauge wanted me to write, in the green ledger, in my own handwriting, next to 50 years of other men writing the numbers the gauge wanted them to write. And I told myself I was doing it because I needed the readings to look normal until I understood more. But the truth underneath that is that I was afraid. And writing the normal number was a way of pretending I hadn't seen what I'd seen. I joined the line of men that morning. I want you to understand that I was already part of it before I ever understood what it was. Edgar's next visit wasn't for 10 days. and I spent them doing the job and not sleeping and being careful in a way I'd never been careful before. I measured the water with my tape every morning after I logged the dial. The real level kept dropping. A half inch a day, sometimes an inch. Slow, steady. The dial never moved more than its usual seasonal crawl. Whatever connected the float to the needle had been adjusted, geared, fixed in some way I couldn't see from the well cap. To report a lie that drifted along reassuringly while the actual reservoir emptied a little more every night. And the intake alarm went off again on the 8th of those 10 days. And this time, I didn't lie in bed. This time, I got up. In the dark, with the horn going off under the building in that 4-on, 2-off rhythm. And I went to the common room window, and I looked up the slope at the dam crest. There was a light up there. Not a bright one. A dim, low, moving light. The color of the bulb in my own window, the 40-watt yellow. And it was moving along the crest of the dam, slow. The pace of a man walking who isn't in any hurry. It went from the far end toward the middle, and then it stopped, about where the spillway gate housing is, and it stayed there the whole time the alarm sounded. And when the alarm cut off at the 8-minute mark, the light went out too, at the same instant, like the same switch did both. I stood at the window with my heart going, and I did not go outside. The 4th rule was in my head. Anyone on the property who says they're the caretaker, the resident, the man who lives here, they're mistaken. Don't correct them. Don't let them in. Log it and call the district. And the 5th rule, keep the light on. It is not for you. I understood the 5th rule a little then, standing there. The light in my window wasn't for me to see by. It was a signal. It told something up on that dam that there was a man down here, in the residence, doing his job, keeping the readings, asking no questions. As long as my light was on, the thing up there had what it expected. And it left me alone and walked the crest and went back down wherever it went. The light was a way of saying, I'm here and I'm not going to be a problem. The caretaker before me, the one who liked the dark, who turned the lights off. Bad things happened, Edgar said. Of course they did. He'd stopped sending the signal. He'd made the thing come down to see why. I logged the alarm in the ledger the way you're supposed to. Intake test, 2:09 a.m., duration 8 minutes. I did not log the light on the dam. I did not call the district. I told myself I'd ask Edgar. I did ask Edgar, in a way, when he came. I decided I'd be careful, that I'd feel him out, that I wouldn't show all my cards, because I still wanted to keep the job, and I was afraid that if I showed him I'd dropped a tape down the well, he'd let me go. And then where would I be? And I'm ashamed of how much of my thinking in those weeks was about not losing the check. A man at the edge of broke makes a terrible investigator. He keeps flinching back toward the money. So when Edgar sat at the kitchen table with his clipboard and his glasses he never wore, I said casually that I'd noticed the reservoir seemed lower than the gauge read, walking the crest. I didn't mention the tape. I framed it as an eyeball thing. Looked low to me up top, I said. Gauge says 11, but it looks more like 9, 10 up there. He didn't look up from the clipboard right away. When he did, his face had gone careful, the way it had gone careful when I'd said 7 minutes about the first alarm. You read it from the crest, he said. Flat. Not a question. I said I'd just looked. Eyeballed it. The first rule, he said, says you read it from the gauge house, never from the crest. You know why that rule's first? He set the clipboard down. Because it's the one that keeps the rest of them working. You read the gauge. You write the gauge. You don't go up top and start measuring with your eyes or anything else. Because the second you decide the gauge is wrong, You start wanting to find out where the water's going. And the only place to find that out is down the tunnel. And the tunnel is the one place I cannot protect you. Do you understand me? I said I understood. I half meant it. The water's fine, he said. The gauge is fine. The reservoir does what it does. Your job is to read it, log it, keep the light on, and follow the 5. That's the whole job. The men who do the whole job, they're fine. 40 years, some of them. Pension, quiet life. The men who decide they're smarter than the 5, they're the ones who don't last. And it's not because I fire them. He let that sit. It's because they go looking. Don't go looking. 40 years, some of them, he said. Pension. But the ledger said the handwriting changed every few months. More than 2 men a year. I'd counted. Either Edgar was lying to my face about men lasting 40 years, or the 40-year men weren't in the ledger I had, or the men in the ledger weren't leaving the way leaving usually works. I sat there with that contradiction, and I didn't say it out loud, because saying it out loud would have told him I'd read the ledger close, and I'd learned by then that everything I knew was a card I didn't want to show. Before he left, he did the thing he'd said he'd do. He took me down the lower tunnel during hours to show me how to clean the intake screen, because that was a real job that had to happen, and he couldn't have me skip it. The lower tunnel runs from a steel door at the back of the pump room, down a long concrete passage that slopes under the base of the dam toward the intake, where the reservoir water enters the system through a screen that catches leaves and silt and the occasional dead fish. It's maybe 150 yards of tunnel, lit by caged bulbs along the ceiling. And the bulbs, as I'd been told, are on a timer. Edgar showed me the timer box at the tunnel entrance, a gray metal box with a single dial and a window showing the hours, 9 to 3, the rest of the face blacked out with paint. He showed me there was no override. The switch that should have let you turn the lights on and off by hand had been removed. The hole in the box plated over and screwed shut. The lights came on at 9 and went off at 3, and there was no human way to change it. If you're down there at 3 by accident, he said, or if they go off early, which happens, you walk out. You don't run, because you'll fall and break your leg on wet concrete in the dark, and then you're down there till they come back on. And you do not want to be down there in the dark. He looked at me. And you don't go back for anything, not a tool, not a light you dropped, not a sound. You walk toward the entrance and you keep walking, and you don't turn around. You got that. I got that. We cleaned the screen. It was wet, ugly, ordinary work, raking muck off a steel mesh into a bucket. And the tunnel smelled like cold stone and rot, and something underneath the rot that I didn't have a word for then. A smell like the inside of a well, like deep water that never sees light. The intake screen was at the far end, and beyond it, through the mesh, was the dark mouth where the reservoir came in. And I stood there with my rake, and I looked through the screen into that dark. And the dark was not the right kind of dark. It was too deep. The reservoir on the other side of that screen should have been pressing against it, a wall of water at 9 or 10 feet of head. And instead there was a space back there, an airspace, a room of dark beyond the mesh, where there should only have been water. And the smell came out of it. And faintly, very faintly, I heard water moving slow and heavy, far back, the same sound from my first night. Edgar saw me looking. "Screen's done," he said. "Let's go." And we went. And he didn't hurry exactly, but he walked me out at a pace that didn't allow for lingering. And he checked his watch when we reached the entrance, and it was 1:40. And I understood that he'd timed the whole visit to be well clear of 3. The next 6 weeks are the part I've never told anyone in full. And I'm going to try to tell it straight, even though straight makes me look bad, because I've decided the looking bad is the point. The water kept dropping. My tape said it was under 7 feet now, then 6. The dial said 11, then 11 and a half. A nice healthy seasonal rise, all of it a lie. And I started, despite everything Edgar said, to go looking. Not in the tunnel. I wasn't brave enough for the tunnel. I went looking in the records. The records cabinet, one of my 10 doors, held more than the green ledger. It held decades of district paperwork, maintenance reports, work orders, correspondence, all of it filed in a way that suggested several different people over the years had tried to organize it and given up. I started spending my evenings in there with the bad coffee and the desk lamp, reading. Because reading paper felt safe in a way that dropping a tape down the well no longer did. Paper couldn't hurt me. That's what I thought. I found the personnel files, or what passed for them. A folder for each caretaker, going back, thin folders, a hiring form, a few pay records, and then, in most of them, a single final sheet. The sheets were standard district forms, the kind with a title at the top and boxes to check. And the title on these was resident status change. And there were 3 boxes, resigned, terminated, and a 3rd box that just said transferred to facility maintenance. Almost every folder had the 3rd box checked. Transferred to facility maintenance. Dozens of them, going back decades. Men who, according to the green ledger, had simply stopped writing one day, were all, on paper, transferred to facility maintenance, which is to say transferred from the job of caretaker to some other job within the facility, except there was no other job within the facility. There was one job, one man, one building. There was no facility maintenance department. There was just the building and the tunnel and the dam and the dark room behind the screen where there should have been water. I found my predecessor's folder. The careful small handwriting. His hiring form gave his name, which I'm not going to say, and his final sheet had the 3rd box checked. Transferred to facility maintenance, dated 3 days after his last entry in the green ledger, the entry where he'd written about the key and the tape. And the form was signed by Edgar Voss in the supervisor line. And the resident signature line, where the man himself was supposed to sign to acknowledge his own transfer, had a signature on it. I knew his handwriting by then. I'd read 7 weeks of it in the ledger. The signature on the transfer form was not his handwriting. It was close. Someone had tried. But it wasn't his. Someone had signed my predecessor's name to a form acknowledging his own transfer to a department that didn't exist. 3 days after he'd scratched a warning into a key, because he didn't trust the building to let a warning survive on paper. And here's the thing that put the cold in me and never quite left. The handwriting of the forged signature, the careful imitation of my predecessor's name, was the same handwriting that had filled in the green ledger during the weeks the building was supposed to be empty between my predecessor's last entry and my first one. The same hand had taken the readings in the empty building and signed the dead man's transfer. And I had seen that handwriting one other place. I went and got the green ledger, and I checked, and I was right. It was the handwriting that started the very next day after every caretaker stopped, every single time, for 50 years. The continuity hand. The hand that bridged the gap between one man ending and the next man being hired. The hand that kept the readings going 6 and 6, 6 and 6, no matter who was or wasn't there to take them. I had assumed before that the continuity hand was just Edgar, covering the gap, keeping the logs clean for the district. But Edgar was 60. The continuity hand went back 50 years, unchanged, the same careful imitative penmanship in the 60s as in the 90s as last month. And it didn't write like a man writing his own hand. It wrote like a hand that had spent 50 years learning to write, like whoever it needed to be. It wrote like something that had taken a lot of men's handwriting and could do any of them. I stopped reading that night. I put the folders back exactly as I'd found them. And I went and checked the light in the window, and it was on. And I stood there a long time making sure it was on. And I thought about leaving. I want to talk about why I didn't leave, because it's the most honest and least flattering part of all of this. I had nowhere to go. That's the simple part. I had a check coming and a bank account that had stopped being a source of dread, and a storage unit that was finally caught up on its late fees because of this job. And the thought of getting in my truck and driving up that gravel road and out into a world where I'd be 41 and broke and looking for contract work again, that thought genuinely frightened me more in the daylight than the building did. The building was frightening at night. Poverty was frightening all the time. I'd lived in it long enough to know which fear had teeth. And there was a quieter reason, one I'm more ashamed of. I'd started to feel safe. Not safe like comfortable. Safe like a man who's figured out the rules of a dangerous place and follows them, and therefore believes the danger is for other people. For the ones who go looking, who turn off the lights, who run in the tunnel. I followed the 5. I kept the light on. I wrote the dial, not the tape. I told myself that as long as I was a good caretaker, the thing the building managed would have no reason to come for me. And that belief, that I was different from my predecessor because I was more careful, that was the most dangerous belief I ever had. And the building, I think, wanted me to have it. The rules don't just protect you, they recruit you. Every day you follow them, you're a little more invested in the idea that following them is enough, and a little less willing to do the one thing that would actually save you, which is to leave. So I stayed. I stayed through the fall, into the cold. The water kept dropping. By my tape, it was at 4 feet now, then 3. The dial said 12, a full reservoir, the fullest reading I'd logged. Whatever was behind the screen was nearly done taking what it took, and the gauge was telling the district everything was full and fine. And I kept writing the dial. It was the 3rd week of November when the rule I'd been quietly breaking finally caught up with me, and a man paid for it who wasn't me. His name was Reyes. He showed up on a Tuesday, mid-morning, a district vehicle coming down the gravel road, the first vehicle besides Edgar's I'd seen in 2 months. He was young, maybe 28, in a district polo shirt, with a tablet and a sealed equipment case. And he was friendly in the way of someone new to a job who still thinks the job is normal. He said he was from the district, that they were doing a sensor upgrade across all the facilities, replacing the old float gauges with digital pressure transducers, and he was here to install the new gauge. I knew immediately what that meant. A digital pressure transducer doesn't read a float on a geared tape. It reads the actual water pressure at the bottom of the well. It can't be adjusted to lie the way the old gauge had been adjusted to lie. The second Reyes installed it, it would read 3 feet, 4 feet, the real number, and the lie that 50 years of caretakers had been writing into the green ledger would end. And the district would see that the Halloran Reservoir, which their paper said was full, was nearly empty. And they'd send people, and the people would go down the tunnel. And the second rule existed precisely so that nobody went down the tunnel. I should have stopped him. Here is the truth. I knew. Standing in the gravel lot with Reyes and his sealed case, more about what was wrong with that place than anyone alive, except maybe Edgar. And I had a window, a clean open window, the same kind I'd had with the bank teller. To say don't, to say there's something wrong here, to say get back in your truck and drive away and tell them the road was washed out. I had the knowledge, and I had the moment. And I let him work. I told myself it wasn't my call. I told myself he was district. He had a work order. Who was I to send him away? I'd lose my job. I'd have to explain why. It would all come out. The tape, the records I'd read, the rules I'd broken. I told myself 100 small, reasonable things, and every one of them was a way of choosing my check and my quiet over a stranger's safety. And I knew it even then. I felt it happening. The way you feel yourself taking the coward's road while you're still on it. I made him a cup of the bad coffee. I showed him to the gauge house. I left him there with his sealed case and his tablet. And I went back to the residence, and I sat at the desk, and I picked up the same patch of counter and wiped it, because my hands needed something normal to do. He worked through the morning. I heard him in the gauge house, the whine of a drill, the clink of tools. Around 1 o'clock he came up to the residence, pleased with himself, and said the new transducer was in and reading. And did I want to see the number? I didn't. I said I'd take his word for it. He showed me the tablet anyway. The new gauge read 3 feet, 2 inches. He frowned at it, said that couldn't be right. The old gauge read 12. That was a 9-foot discrepancy. He'd have to recalibrate. Probably the transducer was seated wrong. He said he'd go back down and check it. And he'd need to pull the old float assembly out of the well to inspect it, which meant opening the well all the way up, which meant putting his head and his arms and his light down into the stilling well that connected, at the bottom, to the reservoir, to the 3 feet of water that was all that was left, and to whatever the rest of the water had been going to. He went back down to the gauge house a little after 2. I want to tell you I went after him. I didn't. I sat at the desk and I told myself he was a professional, and he knew what he was doing, and the gauge house was fine. People went in the gauge house every day. I went in it every day. It was just a concrete box with a well in it. I told myself the dangerous place was the tunnel. And he wasn't in the tunnel. He was in the gauge house, and the rules said nothing about the gauge house. I built that wall fast, in real time, brick by brick, and I sat behind it. And I did not go and check on the young man who'd made me coffee-colored small talk that morning. The intake alarm went off at 2:51. It had never gone off in the daytime, not once. It was a night thing, a 2 in the morning thing, every 2 weeks on its cycle. And here it was, at 2:03 in the afternoon. The deep horn coming up through the floor in the 4-on, 2-off rhythm. And I stood up so fast I knocked the chair over. The third rule was in my head. It's testing itself. Don't go to the intake. It'll stop in 10 minutes. But the third rule was a night rule, and this was the day. And the difference broke something in the part of me that had been hiding behind walls all afternoon. And I went to the window and looked at the gauge house, and the gauge house door was open, and Reyes's tablet was on the gravel outside it, face up, and Reyes was not anywhere I could see. I looked at the clock. 2:53. I have thought about the next 7 minutes more than I have thought about anything in my life. The alarm was going. The rule said 10 minutes. And there was the other rule, the second one, about the tunnel and the lights. And the lights in the tunnel went off at 3, and the gauge house well connected to the reservoir, and the reservoir connected through the screen to the dark room. And the dark room connected to the tunnel. It was all one space, all one body of water and not water. And I understood, standing at that window with the alarm going, that the alarm wasn't testing itself. The alarm was what it sounded like when the thing the building managed was taking something. Every 2 weeks, at 2 in the morning, it took its water. And I'd slept through it, called it a test, logged it as a test. And now it was 2:03 in the afternoon. and it had something better than water in reach. A man with his arms down a well. And the alarm was going because the alarm always went when it fed. I had 7 minutes. The rule said wait 10 and then go to the truck. The rule said don't go to the intake. There was no rule for going to the gauge house during a daytime alarm to pull a man out of a well, because no rule had ever needed to cover it. Because every caretaker before me had followed the rules and stayed inside and let the 7 minutes pass. And that, I understand now, is what the rules are for. They aren't there to save you in the moment. They're there to make sure you don't interfere with the taking. I went outside. I'll give myself that much. At 2:55, I made myself go out the residence door and across the gravel toward the gauge house. Against the rule, the first genuinely brave thing I'd done in months, and it came 2 minutes too late, and I knew it would. I got to the gauge house door. The alarm was deafening this close, coming up out of the open well, and the smell was out. The deep water well smell. Thick. The well cap was off, all the way off, the float assembly pulled out and lying on the floor in pieces where Reyes had set it to inspect it, and the well, which was a pipe maybe 2 feet across that should have had 3 feet of water sitting 3 feet down its length, was empty, drained. A dry black shaft going straight down into the dark, much farther down than 3 feet. Much farther down than the floor of the reservoir should have been. A shaft going down past where any well should bottom out. And there was no water in it at all. And there was no Reyes. His boot was on the lip of the well. Just the one. The way a shoe comes off when something pulls. The lights in the tunnel, on the other side of the building, went off at 3. I felt it more than heard it. The building's electrical load dropping, the small change in the air a place makes when a circuit dies. And at 3 exactly, the alarm stopped. Mid-blast, clean. 7 minutes after Reyes went down to check the gauge, the way it always lasted. Give or take, the way the building had been telling me all along how long it took, and I'd called it a test. I stood in the gauge house, and I looked down the dry, black well, and I did the thing the rule told me to do. The second rule, the tunnel rule, even though I wasn't in the tunnel, because it was the only instruction I had that fit. I did not turn back for the boot. I did not call down the well. I did not go back for a light or a tool or a sound. I walked, I did not run, out of the gauge house, across the gravel, into the residence. And I did not turn around. And I shut the door. And I sat on the floor with my back against it. And I shook for a long time. Then I did the worst thing in this whole account. And I want it on the record because everything before it was fear and everything after it was choice. I called Edgar. He answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting. I told him there'd been an accident. A district man. A sensor upgrade, the gauge house, the well. I didn't say the alarm. I didn't say I'd gone out. I didn't say the well was dry and went down forever. I told him a man had fallen in the well, and I couldn't reach him. There was a silence on the line. Then Edgar said, in a voice that had no surprise in it at all, none, the voice of a man receiving expected news. "Did you see his work order? Was he scheduled?" I said he'd had a work order, a sensor upgrade, district-wide. Edgar said, "There's no sensor upgrade. I'd have known. I'd have stopped it." Another silence. What did he install? I told him. A digital pressure transducer. New gauge. I told him the new gauge read 3 feet, and the old one read 12. And Edgar said, "And I will hear this until I die," he said. "Is the new gauge still installed?" Not is he alive. Not did you call for help. Not are you all right. Is the new gauge still installed? Because the new gauge was the threat. The new gauge would tell the truth, and the truth would bring people. And Reyes was already gone. Reyes was a sunk cost. But the gauge was a live problem. And here is the worst thing. I understood the question. I understood it completely and immediately, because by then I was one of them. I'd been one of them for months, since the morning I wrote the dial instead of the tape. And some part of me had been waiting for permission to stop being the man who'd let Reyes work, and start being the man who cleaned up after it. And I said, no, I'll take it out. Edgar told me what to do. Pull the transducer, reinstall the old float assembly, reset the dial to read consistent with the last logged number. Log the day normally, dial reading only. Reyes's truck, leave it, he'd handle the truck. Reyes's tablet, bring it inside, he'd handle the tablet. And the form, he said. There'd be a form. A resident status change for Reyes. Reyes had never been a resident, but the form was the form the district understood. And Edgar would fill it out, and he'd need me to sign as witness. And the box he'd check was the third box, transferred to facility maintenance. And I should not, he said, worry about what that box meant, because worrying about it had never once helped anyone, and had hurt several. I did all of it. That's the thing. I pulled a dead man's gauge out of the well with his boot still on the lip, and I put back the old gauge that lies, and I turned the dial with a screwdriver until it read 12 feet, 2 inches, a healthy full reservoir, a comfortable seasonal number. And I went inside and I logged the evening reading, 6 p.m., 12 feet, 2 inches, in my own handwriting, in the green ledger, the day a man died in front of me. And I picked up his tablet off the gravel, and I brought it inside, and the next morning it was gone from the desk where I'd left it, and I never asked Edgar how. And 3 days later, there was a form on the kitchen table that hadn't been there when I went to bed. A resident status change with Reyes's name on it. The third box checked, Edgar's signature in the supervisor line, and a witness line waiting for me. I signed it. I signed it with a cheap district pen that was already on the table, and my hand drifted, and I wrote the wrong date and had to cross it out and write it again. And I signed my own real name on the witness line of a form that turned a murder into a transfer. And when I'd signed it, the form was gone the next morning, the way the tablet had been gone, into whatever filing system the building kept, the one the continuity hand maintained, the one that would, 50 years from now, be a thin folder some frightened new caretaker found in the records cabinet at night, with Reyes's name on it and the third box checked and a witness signature he wouldn't recognize. Mine, in a folder full of men who'd been transferred to a department that didn't exist. Edgar came 2 days after that. He didn't mention Reyes. He set my check on the table and beside it a second envelope. And he said the second one was a retention bonus, the district's word, for caretakers who passed the 6-month mark. And it was more money than I'd ever held at one time. And he watched me look at it, and he said, "Most don't make 6 months. You made 6 months. You followed the 5, even the day it was hard. That's rare. The district notices that." And then he said, "The thing that I've come to understand was the real offer, the thing the whole arrangement had been building toward since he asked me whether I was a heavy sleeper or a light one. He said there was a role above caretaker, district operations, his role. He was getting on, he said. He wanted to step back, and the district liked to fill the role from inside, from men who understood the facility, who'd kept the readings, followed the rules, signed the forms, men who'd shown they could handle the day it got hard. It came with a real salary. A house, a real house, in town, not the residence. And the work was mostly this," he said, gesturing at the check and the envelope in the table. "Visiting the facility, bringing the groceries, hiring the next set of hands, keeping the readings clean for the district, filling out the forms. Being the continuity, I thought. Being the hand that takes the readings in the empty weeks. Being the one who signs the dead men's transfers and trains the new ones to write the dial instead of the tape. Edgar wasn't the continuity hand, the 50-year hand. I understood that now. That hand was something else, something the building kept. But Edgar was its human face. He was the man who stood between the thing in the dam and the district that signed the checks, and he kept the arrangement quiet. And he was offering me his chair. I asked him, because I had to ask one true thing out loud before I answered. I asked him what was down there, in the dam, behind the screen, taking the water. He took his glasses off and held them, and he looked at me for a long time, and he said, "I don't know. I've never gone to find out. That's the job. The job is making sure nobody finds out, including you, including me. 50 years nobody's found out, and the district gets its facility, and the facility gets what it needs. And the few men who go looking." He stopped. "You saw the folders. You know what happens to the ones who go looking. The ones who don't go looking get a pension and a quiet life. I'm offering you the quiet life." He put the glasses back on. "It's more than I was offered. I had to figure most of it out alone. You've got me to show you the parts that matter." I told him I'd think about it. I have thought about it. I'm still thinking about it. That's where this ends, which is to say it doesn't end, which is the whole problem. I didn't take the role. I also didn't leave. I'm still the caretaker. I read the gauge at 6 and 6, and I write the dial, and I keep the light on, and I follow the 5. And every 2 weeks, the alarm goes off at 2 in the morning, and I lie in bed, and I let the 7 minutes pass. And I do not go to the gauge house, because I know now what the 7 minutes are. And I tell myself that what's being taken in those 7 minutes is only water now. That there's no Reyes anymore. No man with his arms down the well. Only the reservoir giving up its slow inches into the dark. And I tell myself that because the alternative is unbearable, and I've gotten very good over these months at telling myself the bearable thing. Edgar still comes with the groceries. He hasn't withdrawn the offer. He just lets it sit, the way he lets everything sit. And I think he knows what I haven't admitted out loud, which is that a man who'll sign the witness line is a man who'll eventually sit in the chair, that I'm not refusing, I'm only delaying, that the difference between me and the continuity, in the end, is going to come down to time and money, and how tired I am. And I'm so tired. The thing I keep coming back to, the thing I'll leave you with, is the green ledger. I read it the first month like a novel. All those men, the one who drew weather symbols, the one who wrote about the deer. I felt fond of them. I felt like the next in a line of decent, ordinary men. And I was right. That's the part I can't get past. They were decent, ordinary men. Every one of them sat at this desk and wrote the dial instead of the tape, and kept the light on, and let the 7 minutes pass, and signed whatever was on the table in the morning. And they did it for the same reasons I do it. Because they were tired and broke and afraid, and the place was keeping them fed, and not one of them was a villain, and all of them were the reason it's still running. Last week I did something I shouldn't have. After my evening reading, I dropped my tape down the well, the way I hadn't done since Reyes, because I wanted to know. The water's coming back up, slow, an inch every few days. Whatever was taken is being replaced, the reservoir refilling itself from somewhere, getting ready, I think, for the next cycle, the next set of 7 minutes, the next thin folder. The tape said 5 feet 4 inches. The dial said 12 feet 2 inches. The number I set it to with a screwdriver the day Reyes died. And I haven't touched it since. And it hasn't moved. And it will keep saying 12 feet 2 until the day I, or whoever comes after me, turns the screw again. And this morning, there was a new sheet of paper on the kitchen table that wasn't there last night. It's a district form, resident status change. The name typed at the top is mine. The boxes are empty. None of them is checked yet. It's just sitting there, the way the offer sits there, the way everything in that building sits and waits. And I've left it where it is, face up. And I check it every morning to make sure none of the boxes has been filled in by a hand that isn't mine. And so far, none of them has. So far.